Hello, welcome to Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Mark Cate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
This is episode 46. We're going to be talking about True Detective, only the first season from 2014. And as our guest, I'd like to introduce Erik Davis, who has written many books, Techgnosis, Nomad Codes, Visionary State. He also wrote the 33 and a third book about the fourth Led Zeppelin record. And he also does the Expanding Mind podcast, which I've been a guest on. I definitely recommend you check out his work at techgnosis.com. That's Techgnosis. And we usually go, Chad and I take a moment to plug whatever we've got going on, but I'll speak for both of us. Neither of us have anything going on. But Erik, welcome to the show. And what book are you working on now?
I am just wrapping up a book that will come out in the spring from MIT Press and Strange Attractor Press. It's a co-published deal called High Weirdness, Drugs, Visions, and Esoterica in the 70s. And it's based on my PhD dissertation, but it's not overly academic, at least I hope. And so I've been working on it for a very long time. It's definitely a tome, which is kind of a weird thing to put out these days when, you know, even a short book seems like a lot to ask from the attention spans of contemporary human beings. But there you have it. It's a nice big fat tome. We're putting the pictures together and got to go through it a little bit more, but basically done with it.
That's really soon.
Yeah, it's a quickie.
Oh, what was it like translating an academic work to, I guess I wouldn't say populist work, but a more accessible work? Because it's still an MIT Press. So.
Yeah. I mean, it's still scholarly. I mean, it's got, tons. It's got like 800 notes and like, whatever, all huge bibliography and stuff like that. I mean, it was kind of like the long-term plan was that I went into the PhD program going, okay, I don't know exactly why I'm doing this, but at least it'll be like an all expenses paid refuge from the market for 5 years. And at the end of which I will produce a document that I can turn into a book. So when I wrote my dissertation, I really wrote it as a first draft of a book. So while it has, quotations and discussions of philosophy and things like that, it was always kind of a little bit geared that way. So it wasn't like a radical translation. I kind of think I hope to have made it more accessible than it ended up going, because it was just, I ended up just doing a lot of more arcane intellectual work as like my real creative work in the project. And so I was like, I'm not going to take that out. It's too, it was like too much like this work that I had done. So perhaps it ends up being a little bit arcane for some readers, but
I'm game.
Whatever. It's still, there's still jokes. Not a lot, but there's still jokes.
The title reminds me of, like, there's this book I used to have called High Weirdness by Mail.
That's where I talk about that right off the top, because I mean I gotta hand it to Stang for the phrase. I mean that was where I encountered that phrase, and so I like right off the bat I'm like, I read this. It's part of this tradition that I'm talking about, which is like a weird, druggy, anarcho relationship to religion, and like where you both kind of fascinated with it and kind of mocking it, and like this kind of complex relationship to excessive religion as part of one of the themes in the book.
Yeah, it seems like that whole like questioning of religion thing that was so popular for those oddballs back in the day has like sort of disappeared now, and people really just talk about meditation and go on silent retreats and shit now. Like, I mean, like the real oddballs, like the whole, or some of them I guess become like neo-pagans or whatever, but
even that's changed, not to what it used to be. I don't think.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't really know, because you don't really know what's going on in the corners. But my impression with like neo-paganism is that in that generation, like the 70s generation was like kind of a peak, and then it kind of sustained itself well through the 80s and into the 90s. And it's not like there aren't tons of witches and pagans and whatever now, but the kind of social forms that it took then, which to me were more interesting, were very collective, getting together, doing the rituals. Now it's a lot more, solitary, internet-driven, kind of performance-driven, as opposed to like group ritual kind of thing. So yeah, I think things have changed. The relationship to religion in the underground has changed a lot.
All right, a few last things before we dig into True Detective. Our next episode, just to prepare you, it's going to be a Christmas episode, of course. We've missed several Halloweens, but never seem to miss a Christmas. Is this true?
Not surprising, because I love Christmas. I mean, Christmas is my favorite holiday. Like
that means you win out every year because I do not give a shit.
Yeah. Well, I've been waging the war on Christmas on behalf of all that is good for decades now.
Thank you, Chad. So. We're going to be covering Black Christmas, which is ostensibly the first slasher film. That's from 1974. So good if you haven't seen it. Highly recommend it. Also, you can reach out to us at whatthe@scarythoughts.org. And last thing, spoilers ahead. We're not reviewing True Detective. We've all seen it, and so should you. So if you haven't, go do it. Come back and listen. All right. Where do we want to start?
Well, I remember you had some resistance to doing this because you were like, man, fuck that show. And I was like, this is my favorite show of all time, this particular season of this show.
Yeah, I'll save my issues for a little later in the conversation. But the first time I saw it, I was just like, this is the most misogynist fucking thing I've ever seen. Hyperbolic. But upon rewatching it, I don't think that's true at all.
Yeah, it's funny. I saw the first time and I didn't really like tune into the misogyny. I was not entirely satisfied with all aspects of that part of the plot, and then later on I encountered the kind of misogyny argument against it, and I felt a little puzzled, but I was like, well, maybe I was just tone deaf or not paying attention in a kind of typical way. And so I was sort of ready for that on the rewatch, and I don't really, I get it. I could see how someone might mount that, but I didn't really see it, at least compared to so many other things that we could talk about inside and outside of horror. So, I think there's problems in that part of the story, but misogyny is maybe a little simple way of thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, let's dig into that later. Let me complain about True Detective after you guys, I don't know. Other than my initial objection, which I'm mostly recanting, what got you to want to cover this in particular, Chad?
Well, I mean, I love the show. I mean, I've always been a fan of Woody Harrelson. I love Matthew McConaughey. I just think the look of this movie gets New Orleans and Louisiana in particular, or like more correct than anything else I've ever seen. Like it is Louisiana I grew up in. It's not the fucking trumpets and Mardi Gras Indians and shit. I mean, that stuff's there, but it's not there. You don't see that every day. What you do see every day is a fucked up Vietnamese restaurant on the side of like a fishing camp. That's real. Or crappy strip malls that have green plants just growing through them. Like that's Louisiana.
It's interesting. I sort of realized that as far as I can think, anything set in Louisiana or New Orleans in particular, that location becomes like a character. Mm-hmm. Not if a movie's set in Boston, it's not necessarily about, but Boston is often just a backdrop. Whereas if something takes place in New Orleans or Louisiana, it's like this very dominant character that hangs heavy over the entire narrative. I can't think of anything where it's just like incidental that it's taking place. Well,
particularly rural spots. Like it's one thing to have something set in New York or San Francisco or whatever, and it's like, that's clearly part of the character in a lot of films or a lot of... But here it was like, it's not just, we see the city a little bit, but it's mostly the rural area. And there's actually, I had forgotten this. It was wonderful to rewatch. It was like even better than I kind of remembered in a lot of ways, even though there were flaws to it. But there's that scene in the last episode where they just kind of go over all the places where things have happened. Mm-hmm. And you really get that sense, not just of the landscape as a character, but as a kind of cradle of the themes in a way that I found, very affecting. And it's really good to hear you reflect on it as a native of the state, because my impression was like, I don't feel like I'm watching a cartoon, even though there is a whole thing about the Southern Gothic and a certain mode of like whatever. Although it also has an interesting relationship to Texas. That was one of the things that I kind of picked up on again, because I was thinking about like the cult serial killer kind of mode. And then particularly when it's aestheticized in this kind of pagan-y way, where you see like particularly the bird traps and those like weird triangular kind of spooky things and this sort of very earthy imagery that's associated with the cult. And I'm like, what does this really remind me of? And I'm like, it's kind of like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's kind of like the way that home functions. It's like, it's not just artistic, it's actually like really well done. Like whoever did the set design in that is like really paying a lot of attention and careful and loving and, doing it to the hilt. And it becomes part of the horror in this interesting way that while you see that trope as a kind of genre thing, the kind of artsy serial killer, I actually didn't really ever feel a connection to Texas Chainsaw Massacre until that part of it, until this. And I was like, yeah, they're really referencing that. And then like Cole is from Texas. So there's this weird kind of like Texas, Louisiana tension, I think, that's also kind of going on there. Yeah. So I thought it was all pretty thought out on that level.
I mean, that tension's real too. And I think the writer, Nick Pizzolatto, I think like one of his books is Galveston's, which is about Texas, and so he's an East Texas, West Louisiana kind of dude. And, there's great lines about that. Marty says, hey, can you see Texas from your high horse? And like the fact that Cole is from Texas, even though he's from Alaska,
right.
But people are like, oh, you're from Texas. And it's one of the things that makes him an outsider. And it's kind of real. Like, there's this old story, the crews, all the Mardi Gras crews, they're basically these old money cults kind of. And some of them are just like social clubs, almost like, the Knights of Columbus or something like that. But the old clubs, you had to be born into certain families to be there. And there was all this Texas oil money that came to Louisiana in the late 70s and early 80s. And they kind of lured all these professionals from Texas to Louisiana, like, oh, you're going to be part of the Louisiana culture. It's amazing. And they wouldn't let anybody join the crews. And so there was this kind of like anti-Louisiana, anti-Texas like tension that I remember growing up with. Like people shit all over Texas. People hated Texas A&M. Like, yeah. I still hate Texas.
Yeah, that's impressive. I got to check out his book on Galveston because I love Galveston. I only went there a few times because I was in Houston getting my PhD, so I got some Texas, but I mostly just got Houston, which is its own kind of beast. But Galveston was a different order. I went down there and there was a really good occult shop. I can't remember what it's called right now, but I had met the guy who ran the place. Super smart dude. I mean, it was really like top notch, like the kind of occult shops that don't exist anymore because they've been chased out by gentrification, but it was like living large there. I mean, it had lots of gear and costumes and incense as well as all the books and stuff. But the guy had it was really funny. He had sort of snaked into there was a Masonic temple in Galveston, and it's actually one of the few temples where they can still do all of the higher order initiations with all the backdrops. Like it was from the 1920s, and it still had all the 1920s theatrical gear. And he kind of like wormed his way into a position of power at this place, like kind of, playing the game, but not like he's not like an old school Texas Mason or anything. And he gave us this tour of this place, and it was so weird and just wonderful, and all this like, props from, again, the 1920s and these amazing backdrops and all this weird arcana. And it just had this sense. And then there was this extra quality of Galveston where you get that ghostly trace of a place that had been, this once great city, the center of Texas, the capital zone that's just leveled by the hurricane or whatever it is, 1906 or 4, whatever. Not that far around from our earthquake here. And it has this trace, but there's still all these amazing old Victorian buildings. And anyway, I just love that place. So it's interesting to know that Nick wrote something about it.
Yeah, his it's interesting. Like his work, I started reading his short stories and stuff mostly because I liked the series so much, and then I kind of pumped the brakes after I saw the second season, which is hot garbage. I know you, Mark, you kind of liked it, but
I kind of liked it. I mean, in the wake of season 1, it is a far, far, far lesser show, but taken on its own, because we should take it on its own. It's a completely different story. It's just kind of the mood is somewhat similar. I thought it was a delightful police procedural that had a lot of expectation and didn't live up to it, but I was fine with it. Whatever. I think it doesn't not in any way inform any conversation about season 1.
Right.
Like I was certainly watched it out of curiosity, but also like, oh, what can we learn more about this world that these people have created for us? And the answer is not much, actually.
Yeah, I think a lot of the failure of that series, and I'm just going to say failure because I hated it. It's not fair, but I just feel like the dude wrote's not from LA, but he's from Louisiana or the area. And there's so many small touches, like the tent revival thing. I've been to that shit like for real, like in the South, and you go is just like that. There's always weird mutants wandering around. The way the houses look, they're just like half falling down. I mean, the set, whoever did a lot of the scouting for the sets must have been done a great job. And there's also that huge film industry down there now, so people are all on top of that shit now down there.
I'm curious about the authenticity of the sort of like biker gang thing, because there is this scene, just speaking of authenticity, there's of course the scene where he follows the stripper to a rave. Like, yep, that's just a little amped up, but that's pretty much what a rave out in the middle of nowhere would look like. Maybe there are a couple of, okay, the filmmakers took some liberties, but that's what it looks like. But a biker gang, like, I really would love to know, is it like that, or is it just is that a complete Hollywood manufactured moment?
My impression is that once you got the biker gang going, 60s, 70s, they're all over the place, and they're not terribly dissimilar. I mean, there's like huge, violent, evil biker gangs in Canada. A place that's not associated with any kind of untoward behavior.
Yes. Yeah.
And so if they're in Canada, if they're outside of Toronto,
right,
they're probably in Louisiana and Texas too, although I don't have firsthand experience.
And the biker gangs are such a media created like look. Like as I understand it, there's a photograph of a guy, like I've seen the photo. It's a 1940s picture of a dude just sitting on a motorcycle wearing like the motorcycle gang guy hat, and he's surrounded by broken beer bottles. And that picture ran in a newspaper. And after that, that's pretty much like people are like, oh, that's how bikers are. And they started kind of behaving in that manner.
Yeah, we're still reckoning with that news item as a manufactured reality that people have hung an identity on.
Yeah,
it's certainly evolved since then. But
well, let's get into the show itself a little bit more. Like, so title, True Detective. It's clearly a detective story, and I think there's that aspect of it. It's also sort of a cosmic horror show, although it doesn't get super cosmic. It gets cosmic adjacent, I think. And then it's also like a rural horror movie. And I think all that stuff is done really well here. But who do you think the true detective is? I mean, I think most people would say, I would agree with most people who say this, it's Russ Cole. Like, he's the true detective of the series.
Yeah, fair enough. Although I think one thing that you and I discussed off mic that is what True Detective is also in the genre of is buddy cop movies, because the second time I watched it, I found myself laughing a lot. A lot of the exchanges between Rust and Marty, they're pretty funny if there wasn't this the
ponderous overlay.
Yeah, the soundtrack is pretty ominous. Yeah. And if you just sort of like muted that and just heard their repartees, they're pretty damn funny. It's just that they happen to be about the darkest shit ever. And it's funny, thinking about this as a buddy cop movie, I went and looked online, like, well, what are all the buddy cop movies? What do we call a buddy cop movie? And pretty much every single buddy cop movie is a white guy and a black guy, or a white guy and a dog. That's pretty much what buddy cop movies. Well, Jackie Chan is the exception to those. And I was just sort of thinking,
that's why Rush Hour is so innovative for its time. A black guy and a Chinese guy. Holy
shit!
Totally insane.
But especially like Lethal Weapon. Like, I'm getting too old for this shit. Like, Rust Cole has that quality of he's not too old for this shit, but he's over it.
Right.
He's always, and throughout the show, he's always on the precipice of quitting or being back in. So yeah, the buddy cop thing, I think, is really
that's
the
true.
template for this show.
That's true. And also, like in a lot of the buddy cop thing, there's a childishness to the relationship or to the behavior. Even if it's not a comedy, there's still this kind of like goofiness of their behavior. And here it's sort of restrained, but you see that in Marty. Marty's kind of a goof. He's kind of like a big kid in a lot of ways. I mean, he can't stand up to like his rap or his moral code. I mean, he's still just going to kind of go for it. And even though Rust doesn't really have that aspect to him, you still have there is this kind of goofy slop to the thing that puts you in that territory. But I would like to say that part of the true and the true detective is the gesture towards philosophy, which is in some ways one of the most interesting things, unusual, singular things about the show, is that it is explicitly a portrait of someone who at least presents himself as almost essentially proceeding from a philosophical place, who presents himself as a philosopher, as a thinker, as someone who sees through the sort of surface of the everyday, who has concepts and commitments to concepts, which especially ones that are difficult and that push against the grain. And that in some ways is certainly one of the more singular things about it. Just like, oh my God, I'm watching a show that actually has someone who's more or less thinking philosophically in a pretty coherent way. And so in some ways, this is a popular show that is a portrait of what a philosophical person does in this particular situation. And so I read the true is not necessarily like this is true as opposed to a fantasy, but that the detective is like a detective of truth. Like it's not sufficient just to be a pragmatist. It's not sufficient just to even have a moral code. There has to be some kind of deeper quest that is partly motivating, which is partly what makes that character of Rust so interesting. And that's where I was really enjoyed watching it again. You know, you had mentioned, I didn't know there was this philosophy and true detective book. And, you know, there's so many of those kind of things, and I just tend to not look at them because they're just almost invariably middle brow and they irritate me, and it's not the kind of philosophy I'm interested in. But I took a look at it, and I was like, oh, let's see what they're going to do with it. You know, check it out. And most of it was the same thing, like this is middle brow and kind of irritating. They're just like things for undergraduates. And, you know, maybe it's useful in some way, but like this is not what philosophy means to me. It's way too kind of pedantic and kind of, on the one hand, on the other hand, either this or that. And it's just like, this is not what I'm talking about. And in a way, they kind of missed the whole point about the philosophical dimension of the show, which is not that you can think about the things that Cole says or the things that they do or the portrait of evil in a philosophical way. Well, of course you can do that. You can do that with everything. You can do that with Madonna. You can do that with Coen Brothers movies, whatever. The Dude, you can have a book about the philosophy of the Dude. In fact, there is one. Yeah. You know, so you can do that all you want. But what's different about True Detective is that it's actually about being a philosophical person in a world and what the consequences of that are. So it's not like, oh, Cole's interesting because he's saying these ideas and now we can think about the ideas. It's like, whoa, like, what does it mean to be motivated by ideas? Is he really motivated by ideas? Are the ideas a cover for some psychological issue? But if I read it that way, aren't I kind of in a way like trying to dodge the bullet of the philosophy? And that's where I think it gets really interesting, because what I saw this time was, and I'd be interested to hear how you guys relate with this, is that I have a pretty rich and ongoing relationship with what we could call pessimism or nihilism in philosophy. It's always been something I'm interested in. I was interested in Nietzsche right off the bat. I read Lovecraft a lot in a philosophical way, and then kind of got into what he was thinking about the world as well as what the stories were about. And I lean that way in my thought a lot of times. But personally, I have a very kind of vexed relationship to it that is not unlike my relationship to or my enjoyment of supernatural horror. And I want to unfold this as a way deeper into the show, which is one of the tropes that I like about, let's say, Lovecraft is, that there's some kind of knowledge that destroys, that the protagonist is reading and studying and researching and thinking, and you as the reader can see what the larger dark cosmic scenario is that they don't quite see yet. And then at some point they find out something, they discover something, they have a cognitive experience that then thrusts them out of their ordinary human frame into this horror, this reality of cosmic horror. And I'd have to say that in some ways I have a not dissimilar relationship with hardcore nihilism or pessimism, which is that it's kind of in my temperament, it's kind of in the way I think about the world, but I also have a lot of ways in which I'm not that guy. I love laughter, I'm in love, I love my wife, I like living. When I do podcasts, I tend to be kind of upbeat and sort of funny, even if I'm sort of depressed in my head. But I'm always afraid that, like, oh shit, there's just around that corner and I could become one of those guys. Like, I'm not that far away from being one of those guys. And Cole is one of those guys.
Yeah, I think part of it's like, do you like reading about it, or do you live it for real? And like Cole's a character like that lives it for real. And part of his like his technique, he's like his job is being a detective, right? So he's applying this philosophical framework to everything. And there's a deleted scene where he's arguing with one of the girls that Marty's wife set him up with, and he basically like, I don't want to have a child for philosophical reasons. But it's kind of like you start to wonder, okay, is his entire philosophy a defense mechanism, right? Like, does he not want to have a kid because he's philosophical reasons, or because his kid died and he's super damaged, you know? And I think that's like part of like the ending that everybody hates is like, oh, you know, why he has this like turn of heart at the end. And it's like, I don't think anybody really believes in pessimism hardcore enough unless they like starve themselves to death, which is like, I get for whatever reason, like all these people who are like, oh, you can just kill yourself. It's always starving is the only like manly way of doing it. Like that's what everybody says. You have to start. Like Schopenhauer was like, yeah, that means you've really denied the will to live, like more than anything else. You didn't just take a shortcut. Like you had to like sit with it and be like, yeah, this is not for, you know, this living thing's not for me. So I as I watch the show, I wonder at what point did he become like this nihilist, you know?
Yeah, and that's it. It's asking you to and that's where you get into the like, okay, if it's a cover, but if it's covering over an emotional wound, and so I'm going to psychologize him. But by doing that, then I can sort of avoid the argument. Mm-hmm. Like I don't have to actually argue with it. I don't have to actually go, no, human life is more valuable than that, or no, the self is not just some spew of neurons in a completely illusory way. Instead, I can go, oh, well, you think that way because you lost your kid. That's sad, you know. Mm-hmm. But I don't have to really deal with it. Yeah. And so that's what I liked about it is the way that philosophy, like the forbidden knowledge in Lovecraft, is potentially infectious. It's like, oh, it'll get in. Oh shit, it's too late. Oh, and now I know the thing that I can't forget, that we're not actually selves and that we're just hurtling towards death and everything is meaningless. Damn it, like I got it. I got the fucking virus and now there's no way out. You know? And so I liked it because he's both. You can see the way that he's like a wounded person who got infected and spreads the infection. Like, you know, we're at the great scene at the dinner table at the first episode where it's like, you don't want to bring this guy around. He's just going to infect people. Yeah. You know, and yet you are also in relationship to those thoughts in a very rare way for a popular genre. We're like, oh, God, that's right. Maybe that is sort of true. Oh, what am I going to, you know? So it sort of loops you in a way that I also found true of Lovecraft. And so that's like the cosmic horror isn't just that there's this Carcosa and all this kind of mythology of ritual death and this kind of supernatural vibe. It's also the way that horror and philosophy, it's like the horror of philosophy in this case.
Yeah, there's also in cosmic horror, there is often this tension with someone bearing witness to or having revelation that is so horrifying that it drives them insane, but that the tension is, well, what's worse, that the thing you witnessed is real or that you created it in your mind and you're insane? Well, actually, you would hope it's only that you're insane and making it up, because if it's real, that is far more catastrophic, that is universally catastrophic. And I mean, there is a moment towards the end of season 1 where Rust is being scrutinized by Marty, and Rust says, yeah, I thought it might all be in my head at first. And so he's sort of doing that sort of loop on a far smaller scale than cosmic horror. He's just talking about some murders, but at the same time questioning his own sanity. But something that also runs through this whole series, a lot of the characters at some point go say, Marty is a man who knows himself. He knows who he is. Maggie very emphatically
about
says,
Cole. Cole knows who he is.
Yes.
Right. You
Rust
said
Cole.
Marty. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. That Rust knows who he is. And it's also funny that, I mean, we all sort of know the person who's plagued by too much existential angst, that they carry it about them like a burden, like a weight. And I think that plays into this too, where it's like, well, if it's self-imposed, if this is just sort of manufactured as a coping mechanism because you don't actually want to deal with what your real problem is, you can just throw that weight off. Yeah.
Yeah. And then where I'm like, oh, this is really juicy. This is so good. Is that they embed this character in this philosophical problem, which is, fundamentally atheist in the sense that it is both partly motivated by a kind of materialist understanding of the subject and the self as a product of the brain and, very kind of sociological, evolutionary psychology kind of mode, which he makes references to, but also a kind of Schopenhauer, post-death of God, there's no meaning kind of zone where it's not just rooted in science. And he kind of plays both of those zones. And yet that whole process and relationship is immersed in religion and a varieties of religion. And not just religion as a social form with the preacher and then the corrupt preacher and then hit the crucifix on the wall in Russ' otherwise bare apartment, but also religion as a phenomenological experience because, and this is one thing, like none of the essays in that book on philosophy even mention it, that Rust has visions. Mm-hmm. They may be caused by drug overdoses and problems with his brain. That's sort of how he understands them. But they are visions. And the most spectacular vision, of course, is the one that happens just at the end when the evil Yellow King is going to finally meet the Yellow King, and you get this creepy cosmic vortex vision that's clearly not just some neural fluff. It's in relationship to the experience that he's in. So he's also someone who suffers religious visions without being a religious believer, which is a fascinating kind of character to be in.
Yeah, so. He in some ways he reminds. This is kind of this might be a stretch to go but have you seen the new Rogue One, the newer Star Wars Rogue One?
Yeah.
There's a character in it who is not a Jedi but sort of has Jedi powers, and I feel like Russ Cole's a character like that. He doesn't have a belief system, but he has code, and his really strict adherence to this weird code that sort of functions like a religion has given him powers. Like he's like super tough. He can track people. Like his whole life he's basically like a super cop. And I think that the visions and all that stuff, yeah, like no one does talk about it because it's like, hey, this is like a supernaturally powered cop, sort of like a John Constantine or a Harry D'Amour or something like that. Like is literally like that. But it's interesting, like the cosmic horror, the horror doesn't really give a shit if you believe in it or not. And it's sort of, in Rust, it works in the opposite. Like the cosmic hero, it doesn't require belief either. It just sort of acts. And then you see that played out at the very end when he's like, oh, the light's winning. It's like, oh, he's like this weird manifestation of light in this dark universe. It's just kind of interesting because like it's clothed in pessimism, but it's ultimately not a pessimistic show at all. Like it really isn't. And like his pessimism is almost... There's so many red herrings in this show. Like his pessimism is almost like another red herring.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. I mean, one of the things I liked about it, thinking about it with this religious angle, is that I think you could watch the show and, as a pessimist or a nihilist, and while you would be unimpressed with the final season, as many sort of less philosophically minded viewers were, that was sort of generally seen as a failure. I it could have been maybe better, but I actually wasn't bothered by it for a number of reasons.
You mean the final episode or something?
Yeah, the final episode. Yeah, just the way the turn towards the light or whatever, which actually, in rewatching it was even less quote unquote Christian than I thought it was when I first kind of experienced it. But you could watch it in that way and still feel kind of represented. Like my viewpoint in the world has been well articulated by this film. And you could watch it as an intelligent Christian and be like, this whole thing is really good. Not just because at the end, I can say, he's converted. No, I don't mean on that level. I mean someone who's like a complex intellectual Christian, of which there are some, would be like, oh, wait, actually, this is really good. Like you could see the way that Cole is always kind of a Christian in this weird way. And that's why the crucifix is on the wall, even though he's all the things he says. So the ability to layer those two realities on top of each other and kind of suggest a relationship between from a pop TV show is like, all right, guys. Well done. Well done.
Yeah, I have a feel. I mean, I imagine he would never watch it, but Harold Bloom, my favorite film critic, I think he would probably call this, like every time something has a religious angle that he likes, he just goes, it's gnostic. Yeah, like that's his whole thing. Is like, yeah, that's it. And I feel like this would also be a very gnostic hero in the film. You know, because like the belief systems that exist are so weird and unexplained, but they're clearly very like articulated by the people who believe in them. And his whole thing is like it's like he's purpose built to defeat this particular belief system that is like whatever the childers believe in.
Yeah.
And it seems very interconnected. And I like that the supernatural elements of all the characters are sort of blurry, like, you know, because Childers does some stuff that you'd have to be like a super villain to pull off. Whereas, you know, the same thing with Marty and Rusty, they have to be kind of like superheroes. Like they make these weird leaps. Like when Marty finally figures out, oh, green man, green.
Right.
Like you're like, what the fuck is that? Like it's the weirdest leap in the whole show, and Marty makes it. And it's like almost at a point after Marty has just given up on anything else but being a detective. It's like being the detective is their like religious calling kind of. And it's interesting, like Childers even calls Russ little priest when he's chasing him through. Yeah. And then the girl who is the first one that you see killed, she is talking about how she's going to be a nun. It's just this weird, you're almost like, okay, well, like, Rust is part of their belief system. He's literally part of it. It's kind of interesting. It's like homegrown and he doesn't even know about it.
Well, it's also interesting thinking about this in terms of putting this in light of weird fiction. Let's talk about Thomas Ligotti, whose book, Conspiracy Against the Human Race, was a direct influence, a stated influence on this show by its makers. You know, he's a weird fiction author, and he wrote this book, this sort of like the Bible of contemporary pessimism. And he wouldn't say nihilism, but they're so adjacent and certainly in that text. But Ligotti is a weird fiction writer, and he wrote this pessimist philosophy, and this show almost like honors that split between his fiction and nonfiction by making Rust Cole the rational pessimist bordering on nihilist, and the Childers, the villains of this show, are the cosmic horror devotees. They're the fantastical side of Ligotti's writing.
Yeah, yeah.
Something that, as far as talking about Christianity and all that, something that was hard for me not to think of is the way that this show maps onto the legacy of the Catholic Church, almost as a cosmic horror, because I mean, if we step back and speak in generalities, arguably the Catholic Church has been more responsible for the quashing of human desire on planet Earth in the entire history of humanity. I mean, you could maybe argue about other things, but they have been so instrumental in destroying the body as a center of pleasure, ruthlessly, globally, for so long. And it also turns out that they're responsible for maybe the biggest pedophilia ring in the history of humanity.
Yeah.
So aside from the outright hypocrisy there, that strikes me as bordering on actual horror. Like the irony is so stark that if we look at it in human history perspective, the most of this thing and its opposite at the same time, and yet it, even though its influence in, like, let's say San Francisco is clearly waning, it is a very powerful institution globally still. And that's what this show is about, right? It's about these very powerful men to whom there is with whom there's no argument. There's no way around it. And they are exploiting young bodies for pleasure. Yeah.
Well, what I mean, interesting thing about that is it made me think about when I was considering the way that evil is represented and the way that the child abuse is represented, is like, why is it worse in this show, in reality, and in conspiracy theory, and all three of those zones? Why is it worse that the sexual abuse of children takes place in a ritualistic, quasi-supernatural, quasi-pagan / satanic situation? Like, why is that worse? Because the act, the horror, the pain, the suffering, the fear, all that is essentially the same. And yet there's an extra there. And when you were talking about that, I was like, oh, one of the things that's so weird about Catholic pedophilia is that, it is taking place in a religious context. On some level, it is religious. You don't have that degree, that intensity, that institutionalized thing without it having a religious dimension. Well, how could you possibly have that? Can't be a religion. No, it's that their religion's over here and they have pressures, and so they have to do something over there. I don't think that's true. I think the only way that you could have pedophilia to the extent that it has been in the Catholic Church is that if there is internal, behind the scenes, behind closed doors, among priests, some kind of narrative, some kind of story about why that's okay on some level. It can't just be that they're all just happen to be pedophiles who found this as a cool job, or that they're all off on their individual trip, wrestling with their desire and giving into it, and then being saved because the bishops don't want other people to know. No, there's some kind of institutional story that has a religious dimension. Priests have an extra burden, and so it's the sin of the priest that is the farthest that brings them closer. Some crazy culty stuff that goes on there. And I think that's part of what the disturbance of that is, that it has some kind of dimension on that level.
Which is very different from, let's say, a documentary about some priest and what happened. That, the way we are getting access to these stories and the way they're coming in, it's sort of one by one, group by group, but by scale, yes. The way it's institutional, that's super interesting.
Something on that score. I mean, it's interesting because it's hard to talk about. It's hard to talk about ritual child abuse. A, because it's so horrifying. B, because it's such a trope in conspiracy theory that you're already it's this thing. And C, because, I'm sorry, it undoubtedly happens and is part of power structures. Not to the extent that a lot of conspiracy theorists might say, but definitely it's there. You can see that in just looking at the UK and Jimmy Savile and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's there on some level. And it's interesting that it's this show with this commitment to philosophical questions, with a much more sophisticated way of wrestling with these things than most either horror or certainly detective shows, that you have that at the core, not just child abuse, but ritualized, theatrical child abuse. Because in a way, it's the worst horror. And the way that they play with that in the show, I think, is incredibly sophisticated, is the tape. And the way that you put the tape on, you can't quite see it, you sort of get it, it's sort of like the scratchy black and white, like the side of the building, and then it's all about the people watching the tape, which is like reading the Necronomicon, which you don't actually get to read as the reader of the story, but the characters reading it, and they go crazy, and they scream, fuck, oh God, And again, it's like this infection, that there's this infection, and how do you contain the infection, which also motivates, it also motivates moral reaction. It also motivates whatever. And it's a very difficult thing to talk about. And I think they did a pretty good job of at least sort of not just exploiting it, but actually gesturing to it, and even making it complicated with the narrative of the sexualization of Marty's kids. Like, how do you deal with that? You're a parent, you got a kid, and it's like the kid's an innocent little kid, and there's some kind of weird, they're doing some porno drawing, and you're like, where does this come from? And is this someone at school? Where do they pick it up? What are they doing? And it's, it's kind of a primal thing that people go through, is like how the sexualization is confusing and chaotic and potentially dangerous. So they even nuance it in this way, but it's very tough stuff to wrap your head around, to even really talk about.
In that light, it's also very skillful the way that they construct Marty as a character, because he's kind of a chill guy as a cop until his moral indignation gets raised, which only happens around children and family structure, family cohesion, especially his own in both circumstances. And so to build up this character who will freak out at any questioning of the nuclear family structure, then gets pushed to its absolute extreme with this tape, which is, of course, what brings him back into the fold completely in the finale.
Yeah, Marty. I mean, his character. I really like how, in some ways, it's a very basic character. Like, it's just a regular guy with a big ass dick. Like that's his whole line. He has the best line in the whole show. In Conspiracy Against the Human Race, the author talks about this philosopher Peter Zaffe, who I've never read any of his work outside of Conspiracy, but he talks about like these 4 different ways of dealing with pessimism. Basically, like, okay, if pessimism is real, there isn't anything except for just this bleak nothingness. You have isolation, which is you can just take yourself out of it. That could be anything from suicide to just ignoring the problem. And there's like distraction, like you get really super into something. Like, so like you could make an argument that Russ Cole is distracted by being a detective. Like that's his method. And then there's like sublimation, which is you just freak out, which is probably maybe like the Childers direction. But like for Marty, it's like this idea of like anchoring, where you like anchor yourself into some sort of story. And like the Americana, like, 2 kids in a home and being a good dude that just drinks some beers with the boys. That's his story. But he fucks his own story up all the time, which is kind of interesting. Like he always throws the grenade into the situation. But you wonder if it wasn't for his behavior, he would probably be able to live this normal life. And you wonder a little bit, like Rust sort of destabilizes him a little bit, and his behavior gets worse when he's around Rust. And you can't help but wonder if his pessimism doesn't rub off on him a little bit in the kind of the wrong ways.
Well, that's the thing is, we often talk about collective dread, like what is a horror film or text doing to reflect the time in which it's happening. And I feel like that's not really necessarily happening in this show, but there is something happening with Rust where it is this infectious thing. And going back to the thing about True and True Detective, there's so many moments, I didn't notice this until watching it the 3rd time, he so rarely answers direct questions. Like people will often go like blah, 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 and he just won't respond. He'll just walk away. He does so much of that. But he does talk a lot, and what he says the most, if it seems like most of his dialogue is him speaking his truth. He'll just sit there, like his statements that make Marty tell him to shut up, or everybody to tell him to shut up, is he's always just speaking his truth. And that truth being infectious is I think part of that.
It would wear on you too, though. I mean, it's like being stuck in a cop car with a Nietzsche undergrad the whole time. It's just this constant ear beating that he's just getting. And it's like, okay, so you the only really saving thing for him is he's sort of become this super cop by living to this code. And the classic, he's basically an artist. He's given up everything except for this thing that he's doing, and it's sort of driven him mad. And that pursuit of excellence, it's the same thing that the killer's after. He's trying to break free from the wheel
ascension.
He's trying to get through, and you're like, okay, interesting. You've chosen to become this thing. And in the power structure of the family, you don't really know very much about the criminal family, but the character is definitely not respected from the jump. It's not like he was Damien, and he's this made character. It's so how does this character, who's just kind of yet another one of these swamp rats, become more powerful than everybody else, and everybody listens to him? And it's probably through extremism. He went further than everybody else did. I'd love to know a little bit more about the cult as it exists, because I think one of the things they do that's really smart and very realistic to Louisiana is super Catholic, and there's for sure probably Catholic child abuse stuff that happened there. But all the weird shit didn't happen in the Catholic Church. It happened in these weird televangelist communities, the actual ritual murder that the show is even based on, the satanic murder. It happened at a bizarre Bible college or something like that. And you had this tradition of Tammy Faye Baker and all those. They were all in the South. They weren't Catholic. There's this dude, Jimmy Duplantis, who reminds me of the main preacher character. And it's all this weird northern Louisiana where the tradition of the city, or not even the city, but the land, was almost more powerful than the tradition of the Roman Catholic Church. You have pagan Catholicism in Louisiana. You don't have regular church Catholicism. That's a neat little touch. And then the antagonism towards religion during the whole show is so strong. He's talking about the traps and oh, these are just things that people are made it's a story that people believe in, and you tell little
Language
kids.
viruses.
Yeah, and then the next shot is like a shot of a cross that has the same sort of binding as the devil trap net. So it's implying that, it's another story that you believe. But,
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting that when the preacher, I was like paying attention to his sermon, it really resonates with a lot of the dark stars in the thing. He talked about, I think it's you're a stranger to yourself. So he has that whole kind of Gnostic vibe, and then it's like the stars and the wind between the stars. And you're like, God, that's one of the more like spooky poetic lines in the whole thing. And it's funny when you talked about Gnosticism earlier, is the way that Christianity and more Protestantism than Catholicism in a lot of ways has within it this potential. It's already partly Gnostic, and yet it resists its own Gnosticism in the sense that there's an aspect of Christianity that is, this world is just a nest of vipers. It's just a realm of demons and delusion. So get out, get right with God. And that's why you see it more intensely with the Protestant zone, where you don't have the mediating force of the Catholic Church. You don't have as much tradition. It's more like, right now, you here under this tent, get right with God or you're done. And yet Christianity, kind of like these 4 strategies, has to sort of like get okay with the world, partly because it's a worldly institution, and partly because that's what most human beings do, is they figure out, even if this story is true, and that if we all really lined up our eyes right, get right with God, so to speak, we would see the pessimistic truth, and it would be strong enough to prevent us from losing ourselves in distraction and anchoring and these other kinds of things. That's also a potential within Christianity, and so where it most manifests is in kooky Protestant cults, where they split off from some other thing. They split off and they're out on their own. They're non-denominational and they're just going for it. And it takes on that kind of sectarian intensity. And they clearly are working with that in the show. One thing I want to ask you, just because if is more about those sort of rural crews with the masks and all that. Like I thought I didn't know anything about that at all. I just knew about like New Orleans proper and the Indians and stuff like that. But this seemed like a sort of a variation, but something different that has real force.
So it looks really spooky in the show. Like they almost look like clan robes and stuff like that. But probably the best soft intro to it is in one of the last seasons of Parts Unknown, Anthony Bourdain's show. He goes down there and goes to Cajun Mardi Gras, and it's just a different thing. And it's interesting, like they use some of the Cajun Mardi Gras stuff as like color for these murders, but it's so different even than what's happening in the show. It's this really old French wearing costumes to make fun of the king and queen, like carnival type stuff. It's pretty, right. And then all the stuff's homemade, and it's like if you ever looked up like homemade Halloween costumes from like the 20s and 30s, shit's just terrifying because people made just their handiwork made things really dark and disturbing looking. Yeah, it's almost like a pre-capitalist sort of like, now you can just go get your Handmaid's Tale, sexy Handmaid's Tale costume, for Halloween, and like that sort of thing. It's like a pre-civilization look. It's definitely cool. I didn't really have hardly anything to do with it. I've never been to Cajun Mardi Gras. And the most I'd ever even seen of it was in that Anthony Bourdain show. I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. But I've been up in those areas, and like there's just the same people doing the same shit that they normally would. Like they drink pretty heavily up there, Not all of them, but.
Well, I want to ask a question that you brought up, and I think that this is. I also share this, is that I wanted more from the cult. I wanted more cosmology. I wanted more rich. I wanted to know more about what was motivating them. And I do. Upon watching it again, it does seem like to be kind of a flaw. Like it wasn't just like, well, we're actually more interested in the relationship of the detectives and their story than we are in the specifics of that. And I'm like, nah, you get a lot out of the evil of these guys, and it's you get there's a lot of enigma built through the references to supernatural lore and Carcosa and all that kind of stuff. And why do you think that was? They didn't pull that off. Was it too hard to do? They were just too busy with other stuff. Is there something about it that's tough to?
Yeah. On one level, I think it's just not necessary, right? Like it's always going to be creepier to not know than to know. Like, it's like seeing like little pieces of the xenomorph and alien. Like, it's just scarier that way. And the other level I would think is just probably they just didn't need to go that deep into the research. Like, if you look at the books that are on Russ Cole's like tables and stuff like that, one of the books that he pulls out of a box and has a primary, there's a shot that just picks it up. It's just a Taschen symbols book. And I have that book, and it's pretty surface level, you know? So I think a lot of the stuff is like, I don't think that the dude probably has the guy who wrote it probably has a pretty good understanding of pessimistic philosophy, and he's kind of like a Hemingway type dude, like that's his deal. I just don't think he probably personally went super deep into nerd occult lore, and it's just not there. It's just, it doesn't go into that like deep, like there's Carcosa there, but he's not, probably didn't spend high school years reading like Liber 777 or anything like that,
But well, go ahead.
I also think that it's very difficult. So much of conspiracy lore is based around various rituals enacted by powerful men behind closed doors, and we get these little glimpses as to what they may or may not be. And I think that uncovering the details of those things is really tricky. I mean, that was a question I genuinely had, is I realized as I was watching season 1 for the third time that I kind of didn't actually know what this show was about. I knew what was going on, and I got to know the characters better and better. But, okay, so there's this family, and they're powerful, but they're kind of backwoods, and they're part of this cult, or maybe they're not. Maybe they're just individually really, there's just like 3 of them that are doing all this work, hosting these parties for powerful men to rape children, but that doesn't mean that anybody, it's not clear. And again, I think that it's cool that it's not clear, but I realize that I don't know because it's unexplored, and that's partly unsatisfying, but it's also really hard to map out, okay, wait, so the governor and the sheriff also go around constructing these bird traps, or
do they just have that there's a few people doing it and then they like enjoy it? Yeah,
exactly.
It's
sort of like Eyes Wide Shut. Like it ends and you. I mean, that's not a good movie, but it's sort of for the best that it ends and you have no idea what was going on.
I think that movie rules.
Really?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of that film.
Whoa.
Actually. Yeah, I really like that movie. I think it's one of the best portrayals of how jealousy and fantasy go and then become kind of like a conspiracy that locks you into some kind of process.
Wow.
Yeah.
I thought hating on that movie was just a universal agreement that everybody has. That's awesome.
There's so much I like about that movie. Like the treadmill mat shots where like why is he using sound stages for all this shit? It just gives the movie this just like totally unrealistic look, and a lot of time. Yeah, I quite liked it.
I mean, I need to watch it again. I have to say, I will watch it again. Then we'll have another discussion.
And maybe I'd watch it again and agree more with you. But it does end, and you kind of have no idea like what was going on. And partly to its credit, but also partly like how you going to explain that shit?
Yeah.
And before we started recording, we were talking about the Illuminatus. Grand conspiracies. When you talk to a conspiracy theorist, their conspiracy will fall apart by its own logic. It's just that they can't be made to see that. And when it's in fiction, the same thing happens. You can't take it too far. You need there to be a mystery because it will fall apart by its own logic at some point. And I wonder if that's part of the impediment of it being illustrated too deeply.
So here's another way of asking the question, because it's sort of the same thing. It's like, why have the supernatural aura and the reference to weird fiction in that? What does it actually do? Does it just give it a little extra pizzazz? Is it just sort of like, painting lipstick on the pig of a serial child abuser? Why is it not sufficient for it to be simply driven by hatred and lust and violence? Why, why do we find David Berkowitz more interesting? Because the devil spoke to him through the dog. Like, what does that madness add? Is it because there's something about evil acts that bring us actually as moderns closer to the possibility of the supernatural than other things. Like we can't imagine the supernatural through the register of the good. We're like, what? It's either a moral code or it's an inherent something I could explain with Darwin or whatever. It doesn't seem very religious to me to be a good person. Personally, that's my case. Doesn't seem very religious to me to be a good person. But maybe there's something about being a really bad person that gets you close to something like that, that's the only place we can access that possibility. I don't know. I mean, there's something added by that enigma that, well, whether it's both the kind of supernatural character of it or the paganish quality of it, but also the weird fiction. I mean, he chose to, I mean, what's interesting about the weird fiction thing is it's not just that he's alluding to weird fiction, because there's no sense that the people who the Yellow King or any of these people are themselves aware of the weird fiction tradition. They're just doing their thing. So the writer didn't just allude to weird fiction, but he alluded to two elements, the Yellow King and Carcosa, that already had a history of being referred to by multiple writers in multiple contexts as part of the tradition of weird fiction. So weird fiction has this strange character where it starts to play games and refer to itself in a way that is both kind of ironic and playful, but also kind of intensifies the sense that by reading weird fiction, you're actually discovering something that's more than any given fiction is going to tell you. So he's picking up on that in a way that's quite stimulating. If you're into that stuff, you're like, oh God, Carcosa. Nobody talks about Carcosa.
Well, the Carcosa thing is so smart for putting it in like the context of being like a real deal American weird fiction is, that shit goes back to, it predates Lovecraft. It goes back to, Ambrose Bierce, we were just talking about him before we started recording. And that dude's basically a popular Civil War writer. It'd be like if Jocko Willink wrote a weird fiction book and it was out of nowhere and it was super weird. And I think like having so much of the mythology like off camera gives it this really like sexy weight. I mean, like the best Scooby-Doo series is Mystery Incorporated. And the reason why it's so good is because it's bolted onto this weird fiction, this like almost Cthulhu-like thing. And what's fun about it is none of the weird fiction authors, the decent ones, the canonical ones, have done the job of like solving the rules of living in the world. Like, so how to deal with a demon in The Exorcist. Like you just call it the Catholic Church. And that with weird fiction, there is no answer to that. Like there's none of that. So you're like, well, fuck, what do you do? And the closest I guess you get is you just do your job really hard. Like that, it's just this weird thing. And that's kind of how, the Lovecraft characters, they would do it. Like, I'm a scientist and I will explore this gigantic cyclopean ruin with my compass and my ruler. And it just seems so fucking absurd. And it's similarly absurd to have some detectives just trying to break this case. This case is probably hundreds of years old. Yeah. But then like believing that sort of thing's weird because you have these characters who, you assume believe it, like for real. Like there's Jesse, the Ledoux character and all these guys. You're like, okay, well, how do these guys get brought into this nonsense? But people just get brought into nonsense. I mean, look at fucking Hollywood and Scientology. People just believe in shit.
Well, I think that even more plainly, it goes from cosmic horror and introducing the scale of what cosmic horror can introduce into a bunch of characters into a simple police procedural, but almost makes it like cosplay, where those brothers, they might as well think they're vampires because they read Bram Stoker and Anne Rice. Instead, they read a bunch of other books and just sort of laminated another mythology onto their practices, which makes it actually less cosmic horror and more just sort of scary, pathetic. Then it becomes, I was about to say the West Memphis 3, but we might be busting that.
Yeah, well, yeah,
Let's sidetrack.
Yeah, we will get lost down that road, but I'm currently in the process of being like unwoke about Damien Eccles and those kids. Like the more I look at the case, the more I think that those dudes probably committed those murders.
Sorry, Metallica.
Yeah, sorry, Metallica. Sorry, everybody. Sorry, Johnny Depp. It's just, there's just like this like physical evidence that to me is really compelling. For example, each of the kids that were murdered, the 3 children were murdered, tied with 3 distinct knots. Every single time that happens, it means for each different type of knot, there's a different murderer present. And so you have these 3 dudes, 2 of them confessed, one of them multiple times, and they were spotted at the scene. They owned probably the murder weapon. I mean, it's really interesting to see how these kids were sort of railroaded by a fucked up process. Like they were like the weirdest looking kids in town, and we know how that story goes.
Yeah.
So they were sort of basically convicted on this weird story in the middle of the satanic panic, and then unconvicted with like Hollywood social justice. But the fact remains that there was a triple murder that happened, and they probably did it. It's super weird. Like, I don't know. In the context of True Detective, It's like one of those ideas of like, okay, your story that you're telling yourself can affect how you think about these murders. And I think one of the things that's kind of nice about Marty and Rust in this series is they don't really believe in the supernatural at all. And although Russ is experiencing explicitly supernatural events, like he says at one point, he's like, I felt like I was mainlining the secret truth of the universe. And he is. Like, he makes these like really major breaks in the case that are from hallucinations. And like, I think that's a really fun part of the story. It's like, okay, like, is it effectively like, oh, he's like kind of like microdosing like all these fucking dorks in Silicon Valley, and he's using like these hallucination jumps to put his case together? Or is it magical? Or is it just luck? Who knows? I don't know. It's a cool character.
I mean, it is also interesting, like how the range of drugs referred to, and particularly the emphasis on psychedelics, which you don't normally see in those kinds of things. I mean, they talk about, the toxicology came back with the traces of LSD. Well, actually, unless you're looking for LSD, your toxicology is not going to come back with traces of LSD. So it's like they wanted to get that in there in a kind of way. And then when he's hitting the cough syrup, so you're like, so there's a kind of invocation of visionary capacity in both its secular or profane modes as well as its potentially more, I don't want to say supernatural, but cosmic kind of modes as well, which is clearly part of what he is.
And all the major steps that are made in the plot are all fueled by drug or alcohol use. Like nothing, when there's no drugs or alcohol, like nothing happens. And then, I mean, like, he doesn't fuck Marty's wife. Like, he doesn't like realize some weird shit staring at murder manuals in his basement or what, there's no basements in Louisiana, but in his apartment. It's so well done. I think just like not knowing what's happening with it. And another thing is like when he's going in Louisiana and he's hallucinating and looking at those gas plants, that's exactly what it looks like on acid and hanging out by those gas plants, like for real. Like whoever did those scenes must have gone to some shitty rave out in the middle of nowhere, as I did, and saw shit like that. I mean, it's so realistic. And that's one of the reasons why I love the show so much is like that stuff is so realistic that it makes the rest of the series really credible for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We keep talking about the source material. We keep referring to these texts like Legati and I'm sorry, The Yellow King, The King in Yellow was written by
Robert Chambers.
Yeah, Nick
Pizzolatto
was very on the table about what he was influenced by when constructing Rust Cohle. And I think that's another thing that made this show so successful is you were talking about, is this just window dressing or all the weird fiction? But I think that all these secondary texts, I think it's really good writing and really good character construction to go that deep on a character, It's not just unique that kind of source material was applied to a character in a major TV show, but that going that deep into texts of any sort is pretty interesting. Actually, something you brought up is, we've been talking about Thomas Legati, who I really love his work, but I think, Chad, you were saying that some Legati fans had problems with that Rust Cohle was too ripped off from Legati.
Yeah, I mean, I think this would have probably had more legs now that everybody's trying to like shit on everybody's top moments with stuff in the past. Like that seems to be more of a thing now. But there's some people who are I'll just call them genre fans, right? They're like hardcore Thomas Ligotti fans. There's like websites dedicated to his writing, and the way that like I think the best thing you can do if you're a writer is just never talk to any journalist ever, because it's going to make you look way more interesting. So he has like the Cormac McCarthy thing where there's just no interviews with him, except for Cormac McCarthy has his Oprah interview, which is weird. But there is a lot of dialogue that Russ Cole says that sounds a lot like stuff that's in Conspiracy Against the Human Race. But a lot of what is written in Conspiracy Against the Human Race sounds like Schopenhauer, sounds like Nietzsche, sounds like whoever. Like nobody bitches in Clueless when the brother is quoting the Nietzsche.
Yeah.
You know, like
or any movie where there's a Christian character espousing Christian ideologies that are lifted straight from the Bible. You're like, well, they just lifted that from the Bible. Yeah, that's what that character would do.
Yeah, and even Thomas Ligotti, he says something like, these visions and ideas aren't necessarily mine. They're a synthesis of all the things I've read and learned and seen. And if this movie was just Cobra with some Schopenhauer on top of it, the movie Cobra, that would be like a totally different thing. But this movie is so well wrought in other ways, and it's just a flavor. And it's like, I don't know. I mean, maybe he punched up some dialogue with it. I mean, if you look at the second season, the dialogue's terrible. So maybe it came from somewhere. So who knows?
Yeah, I didn't. That one didn't really work for me either. Just because, I mean, once you're dealing with philosophical ideas or whatever positions, and again, there's just so many voices, even in the Ligotti book that he's referring to, and in a way, that's also part of the game. I mean, that's what's interesting. I to come back to something I mentioned before is that Carcosa and the Yellow King are not just from the weird fiction tradition, but there are very particular figures that have already been repeated and reframed in multiple texts by multiple authors over a very long period of time. And if you go back also to The Yellow King, comes from a play that's in a couple of the stories. There's a series. The King in Yellow is a series of stories. It's like in the 1890s. And in a number of the stories, there's a reference to this play, The King in Yellow. But if people read it, they go crazy. And you get a few little lines from it, but that's all you really kind of get in it. And Lovecraft explicitly was using that to get the sort of mode of the Necronomicon, that there's some book that is itself so evil that da-da-da. So the references aren't just to weird fiction in general, but to the infectious capacity of these things to kind of come through. And it's the same thing with philosophy. Mm-hmm. You read, especially a modern philosophy book, it's going to be just dense with meme influence. It's just this kind of collective mutant. And Ligotti reads like that, and he's referring to these people and explaining their ideas or whatever. So that just seemed kind of like fans not really getting what, and that's the only thing they know. So they think that he's like a completely original, kind of pessimist. I mean, in a way, it's sort of cute because it's like nice, like they're defending their dude or whatever, But give the writers a break. I think that was still pretty well handled.
Yeah, like I had never read any Schopenhauer before True Detective, so I can't be like, well, back in the day I was reading this shit. Not at all. But when you go back and look at all these articles about plagiarism in True Detective, it's like the word Schopenhauer does not appear anywhere. So it's like, okay, so the only people who raise this concern are these nerds who are just super into this horror writer. Okay, great. And then people who wanted to get a scalp somehow, and they had no real. And then all the writers, like the journalists who wrote about it, they're not invested in genre and they're not invested in philosophy. So a lot of their articles were just lightweight and just didn't penetrate too deeply. And then Nick Pizzolatto did the smart thing, which is just didn't say anything.
Yeah,
he's like, yeah, fuck you guys, no, that's it, and that was it. And it kind of died off.
It's rare that pessimism and nihilism make it into, especially entertainment news, maybe around punk and metal, but in a very different capacity, I mean, even so, another influence on True Detective was Eugene Thacker's
title of his book.
Pretty much just the title of his book, In the Dust of This Planet, which I just got a tattoo of.
I know. I'm so disappointed.
Wait, isn't that later?
Isn't what later in the show?
When did that come out? When did that?
The book?
Yeah.
It predates the show.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
It's
Eugene
like
Thacker wrote
2011 or something
a
like
book
that.
called In the Dust of This Planet. Radiolab did actually pretty much an episode about In the Dust of This Planet.
Right.
So it's very odd to have like one of the biggest podcasts do a fluff piece about a piece of ostensibly nihilist philosophy and the way it intersects with True Detective on HBO and Jay-Z's
Right.
costume designer and anyway.
Yeah, that was very peculiar watching all that happen. I mean,
Yeah.
it seemed like in retrospect a sort of innocent period where you had enough time and space to trace a kind of appropriation across genre of something that is relatively arcane, and now that stuff is so you can't even get back to where it comes from, and it was sort of like hard to even think about tracing something in that sort of way.
Yeah.
And I think Eugene has a great line there where he goes, well, I write books that people don't read.
Yeah, which is exactly what Glenn Beck said about him.
So then you write this book that people don't read, and it has this very strange crossover.
I'm just gonna lay it out here. I don't think that book's that good. Sorry, I know you got the tattoo.
It's already on my arm. So
I
it's
know.
nothing.
I know.
But it's too late for me to agree with you now.
I should probably explain that what I mean by not that good,
whatever.
and that like it's basically in the way that Conspiracy Against the Human Race is just a survey of the available literature. Like in the Dust of This Planet, it starts off making kind of an interesting argument about the world as it is and the world as it really is if there was no human intervention and there's just this spiraling chaos and all this stuff happened. And then he talks about the world as humans see it, where you're like looking into it, and the idea that even pessimistic philosophy is just yet another lens of looking through your own eyes at the world, and even pessimistic philosophy isn't going to get you anywhere, which is a pretty interesting idea. But then he just sort of abandons that thread and just starts naming cool albums he likes that he thinks are philosophical. I mean, it's pretty much what
I kind of want to go, well, no, he doesn't, but it's close enough, whatever.
Yeah. I mean, like, I think that, like, you could probably teach a really fun course that was, like, In the Dust of This Planet, Conspiracy Against Human Race, and watch True Detective, and then here's, like, Schopenhauer's own literature essays. Sure. Would probably be a pretty good way into it. But, yeah, I don't know. I've just been, like, heavily nut riding on Schopenhauer since we started thinking about this episode. Yeah.
He's a good writer too. That's the interesting thing
the
about
other thing about
pessimism is, in a weird way, it's all about style, because I'm not going to sit and read that crap if it's not engaging, because there's no reason for it. But like Schopenhauer's a pretty good writer,
And also, I mean, funny you should say that, because when tackling philosophy in general, it seems that, and especially a lot of this circle of ideas, you sort of have to confront Kant, who's impossible to read, or Hegel, who's worse. And so much, Wittgenstein, holy shit. And whereas Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Ligotti, Thacker, so fun.
Yeah.
Sometimes funny.
Yeah.
Certainly like weird and wonderful and poetic, which is... there's such a rhetorical joyfulness in some of the darkest philosophy that's at least floating up at the top.
Humor and darkness and like this kind of like gallows humor is one of the reasons why I like so many of, like, not even philosophy, but like fucked up stuff. Like, I think Might Is Right by Ragnar Redbeard is fucking hilarious to read. And it's kind of like taking Spencer and Nietzsche to like its extreme. Like, well, yes. I mean, you could imagine any number of Thor Hammer Tattoo having Instagram influencers being into that book, because it's just basically like, you take what you want because that is what is right across all cultures and blah, blah, blah. And it's a really forceful, interesting thing. And it reminds me of what Eugene Robinson said about all the fascists he has known. He said they all respect strength more than anything else. And I think about that all the time, because I was like, at the time I was like, man, he's totally right. Like, all these dudes that are like, cosplaying as like fucking Mad Max characters, they're all about strength, and there's this like underlying interest in fascism. But then I thought about it more as like, is it wrong to admire strength in that capacity? Like, it's appealing, it's sexy. I think if like Russ Cole wasn't such a powerful character, you wouldn't give a shit about his pessimism. Like 99% of the times when you hear those ideas coming out of somebody, it's some fucking sad dork that has nerd neck and he's bent over and he's collected too many D&D manuals, and it's really unappealing. What's interesting about True Detective is it's married these ideas to like an attractive look. I mean, I don't know.
No, he makes it look cool. I think
and that's the thing with In the Dust of This Planet. Sorry, external people, Jay-Z's costume designer mainly, made it cool.
Yeah,
cooler than it is.
Well, Russ Cole is a cool character. I mean, he's got the 1,000-yard stare. He's the brooding. The character's just sitting there in silence, and you can just see the gears turning so heavily with so much burden. I think that might be a good segue into my big sort of like complaint. It's not a rant, but long ago, Chad, you and I were having a conversation about weird fiction, and you said some variation, or you posed a certain kind of question about the position of women in weird fiction. And you didn't mean writers, because there have been women at the proto-weird fiction and throughout its history, maybe less than they should be for obvious reasons. But I think you meant maybe the feminine in what the world of weird fiction is and represents. I don't know. We're sort of talking through those sorts of ideas. I don't know. Is it worth articulating? Or
a little bit. I mean, if I can remember correctly, I think part of what I've been thinking about in pessimistic fiction and cosmic horror and all that stuff is there's now like, I always talk about Harold Bloom because I love him, how crusty and just you just can't bring him into the modern conversation anymore because he's just not having it. But he talks about the critics of resentment and about how like people bring their current trendy concern, whatever it be, not that feminism is trendy, but the latest flavor of it, they bring it to bear on these old things that are canonical and just too big for this weak criticism. And I think in some ways the idea of like total cosmic horror, it's worse than patriarchy. So just by the story, right? Like in the real world, like probably you can make your case for like patriarchy being terrible. But if you're making this weird story, it's like saying like, okay, patriarchy is this evil creature. But in cosmic horror, there's an even more evil creature on top of it. So it's like you're not going to spend too much trouble investigating the lesser evil when there's a greater evil that the story's about. And I think probably what that does is undercut a lot of the anxieties that women suffer in the real world, and that's where real terror comes from. So you don't get the female perspective articulated very well in cosmic horror because it sort of like effaces all the things that women would be terrified of in horror and replaces them with this other thing like, wow, isn't it really scary that there's just nothing out there except for a fucking space worm that's going to eat you? Like I don't know if that's doing like justice or injustice to people.
Right.
But I feel like it's also not concerned with racism for the most part. I mean, even though H.P. Lovecraft is about as racist as you get and has all these like terrible sonnets that are super terrible to read, but is it his job to address that in this cosmic horror story? Right. I don't know. And now it seems like everybody wants it to be everybody's job to address that stuff. So like, is cosmic horror going to get more woke? I mean, maybe. And in some ways, that's Lovecraft country, right?
And
like
the Ballad of Black Tom.
Yeah. And I didn't think Ballad of Black Tom was that great, but I thought Lovecraft country was awesome. And it does a really good job of introducing race into the conversation because the idea is like, okay, like, and this would be interesting for women, is like in Lovecraft country, these characters have a different way of dealing with cosmic horror because their day-to-day life is so shitty. So you wonder if, women could be better represented in cosmic horror, like by something like, like guys are terrible. I'm used to guys being terrible. So obviously Cthulhu's terrible. I can deal with that a little bit. And I think the women in True Detective, they're definitely not as interestingly rendered as the male characters, but they sort of do that. Like they are aware that the world is fucking terrible.
Right.
Like the madam, she's like, well, women have to learn this shit early. Like they're existing in the same terrible world, but it's worse for them, and they're sort of more capable of dealing with it because the real world's worse.
Sure. I mean, and this is and I hate using the word problematic.
It's the worst.
But I'd like to use it actually correctly for a change, that this is the problematic that exists in True Detective and weird fiction, is that, well, especially in this show, there's all this existential brooding. I mean, not just Russ Cole, this whole show, its tone is existential brooding. But the thing is, it is on the backs of the suffering of women's bodies. That's what the show is about. I think there's one boy, but it's pretty much like all women's bodies in suffering. And that's what this show is based on. While all the men are like wrestling with their inner demons, it's like women are being murdered. And that disparity is kind of the legacy of existentialism. It's the legacy of weird fiction. It's this sort of like men are in their heads trying to grapple with reality, and it doesn't account for sort of like real physical trauma and suffering. I'm making incredibly broad brushstrokes when I say that, and I'm glossing over a lot. But at least in this show specifically, and I don't want to sort of necessarily go like, this was problematic and this is problematic, but rather the way in which I kind of objected to this show in a very knee-jerk, not very thought-through way, I think was based on a lot of things. Like right at the opening credits, you get Rust Cole brooding, you get Marty brooding, you get a naked woman's ass, you get a naked woman shaking her body, you get Rust Cole brooding. Like it's just right up front. Like that's what you're in, and you know that's what you're in for. It's true to the show. And then the first time we see Maggie, we see her ass in panties, right? And
all these things are great, by the way. I'm not against any of it. Like Marty's girlfriend, so hot.
Well, here's the let me get into that in a minute. It's also very telling that Rust Cole, when he's sort of dropping his truth bombs or whatever we want to call it, he's always saying, man is this and man is that. And of course, yes, that's the way our language is constructed. That's the way it's always been constructed. But let's not be ignorant of the way linguistics work. When you say man or mankind, you're inferring a certain kind of legacy and struggle that when you say people, it doesn't infer. And so when you construct a sentence by starting it off with man is this, you're talking about a very specific kind of perspective. You might not be talking about biological men to the exclusion of women, but you're definitely already talking from a very specific kind of perspective.
You're talking about men who count. When you're saying that, like you're like when you're saying like man is free to do whatever he wants, like you're only talking about like when you're saying that you're really only talking about the type of men who are capable of doing what
in a
they
certain
want.
way.
Yeah, like it's a really aristocratic way of looking at
sure.
shit.
Yeah. I mean, it's about a certain kind of agency and a belief in that sort of agency, and I think that this all revolves around male fantasy, and that's definitely another component to all this that I think is really interesting when thinking about weird fiction and all this philosophy and True Detective is in creating art and having a freedom to express yourself, you're often creating a fantasy in some way. And so many men having so much liberty to create their fantasies, that male fantasy, it becomes very tiresome because it's so reflective of a very narrow sort of idea of what can be projected into the world. And so there becomes this repetition, like one of my biggest sort of like gets in my craw about this show. It's about Hollywood in general, which is the male fantasy of the older man and the younger woman. And I brought this up on the last episode. And just to sort of sum up, like I check IDs for a living. When a straight couple walks up, the man is always older, 9 times out of 10 or more. But that's true by like 3 years. In Hollywood movies, it's 10 to 20 years, and it's virtually never not. And so in this show, Woody Harrelson's character, Woody Harrelson is 15 years older than the woman who plays Maggie. He's 25 years older than his girlfriend. He's 22 years older than his second girlfriend. And then just thinking about him in general, something that really pissed me off about 3 Billboards Outside of Ebbing, Missouri, is he gives all this grief to this other character about like cradle robbing, but he is actually decades older than the woman playing his wife. Like there's this internal irony that Hollywood doesn't, it's pointing a finger at this thing that it's totally guilty of. And then, Natural Born Killers, Juliette Lewis is playing opposite him. It's like, is it in his contract? Is this like Tom Cruise on a motorcycle? Woody Harrelson has to be having sex with a really hot woman that's at least 15 years younger than him?
He deserves it.
I question this. Anyway, in the era of Me Too, there's just this, it's so funny that there's all this like, awareness being brought up, and it's just so absolutely systemic to the way we tell our stories. This is a part of it. It's not just sort of a backdrop. It's not just who forced who to have sex in the background. It's one of the dominant modes of us telling our stories and our histories is totally dependent on men telling the stories, and only very specific kinds of women with a very specific age range are backdrops to those stories.
Do you think it's
and I think that this is true of True Detective.
Do you think it's only a male fantasy though? Because I was thinking about this the other day when you're like, oh, it's such a male fantasy. Like,
Yeah.
I think though there's like a certain type of woman that also enjoys that same fantasy.
Absolutely, no question. The thing is, we could get into a conversation about, well, is that biological? How does this happen? Is that just patriarchy? The thing is, I don't know. All I know is that this is fucking boring. That why do we tell these stories in exactly the same way every time? Why is it just always a reification of a younger woman with less power with a more powerful man?
I think it probably has something to do with biology. Like, I think there's probably some sort of like biologically driven interest in, like even in Jane Austen, they talk about when women have passed their bloom, which I guess is like 14 or whatever in those books. But there's like, even in those books, there's more of a value put on women's youth than there is on men's youth. Like, men's youth is spent on war and is more disposable than women's youth. I mean, even in the movie Malcolm X, like the character of Elijah Muhammad gives him his formula on how old a woman should be. It's like half a man's age plus 7 years. It just seems deeply encoded into every culture.
It is unquestionably encoded into every
I'm not
culture.
saying it's
that
good.
doesn't mean, yeah. The problematic I am questioning is, why is this pervasive? Why does this continue? And why is it actually so strangely invisible? I mean, it's not invisible. It's right out there in the open, but it doesn't seem to change.
Are you saying that it doesn't change in representation in film, or it just doesn't change in general?
Bit of both.
Yeah, because I mean, just think about Anna Nicole Smith and her late husband. Like, that was true love.
Get your coin, girl.
That was true love, right? I mean, I just think there's a lot of that going on.
Sure.
And you can't blame like a writer for just reinforcing it. I mean, I'm not saying that you're blaming a writer, but I'm just saying in general.
I'm blaming a writer.
Well, to say it's problematic, I would say just the fact that there are a bunch of gold diggers and old men out there, and predatory old men and young girls, and all the different alignments that end up with that. Like, I think, or just competence. The fact that women don't like incompetent boys and probably like men more than goofballs their age. Like, no one should have ever hung out with me when I was under 30 at all. I could say that with authority.
Yeah.
Like, it's just like the younger male is just not as appealing as the younger woman is. And in Hollywood, you're looking to make a more attractive couple for the stage. I just think there's probably some naturalistic thing happening there. I mean, do you think you're going to be able to undo it?
Nope.
See, natural.
Can't fight patriarchy, even from the inside, Chad.
No, you cannot.
Okay, thanks for listening. What else you guys got?
I have so much shit here. You wonder a little bit, like, if the choice of having a female character as the detective in the second season was like a response to criticism.
I wondered the same.
Yeah, it's like when Lane Dunham gets all this flack for not having any black people on her show, and she's like, "Next season, I'm fucking one." Like, it's you wonder if it was the same sort of just dreary Hollywood calculus.
Isn't Lena Dunham an amazing example? She's a great go-to.
Man, I would love to hang out with her. One of the notes I had was like, okay, pessimism. Say you believe in pessimism. Like, man, I'm all about this shit. I believe there isn't anything, whatever. You still have to sort of make your way around in the world. And I think that like a person who adhered to pessimistic philosophy, they're going to end up in the same boat like your average Catholic or Muslim does, where you're like, yeah, I believe it, but what I want. Like, so I wonder a little bit if to me, like the Eugene Thacker book was a little bit of like cafeteria pessimism, a little bit like taking the attractive pieces, like in the way that you have like cafeteria Catholicism. Like, I like praying to St. George, but I don't care about people getting married if they're gay. Like, I wonder if that, like, you see, like, Nietzschean sort of characters, like that's almost like what like Ayn Rand is, right? Like she's like chosen the pieces of pessimistic philosophy that supported her love of capitalism. And I wonder if we're sort of in this moment where we are seeing nihilism kind of in the culture a little bit. Like you have Rick and Morty as a nihilistic show, or BoJack Horseman is another nihilistic show, but none of them go like all the way that would make you really disturbed. Like the Ernest Becker denial of death thing, where it's like, man, this is actually totally terrifying that you're flying around on a rock and you're going to be sucked into a void in a few years, and no one will remember you in a few years after that. Like, it's pretty dark shit. And I don't think it's ever going to be popular. And I feel like True Detective might have been the high water mark for the popularity of those ideas.
Well, or for representing somebody who does walk the talk, and that, I think that's part of what you're talking about, is that, like, I mean, one thing when I was reading through that philosophy book, the philosophy of True Detective is like, most of them were like professional philosophers or neuroscientists or whatever. And they were so quick to, like, it was just assumed from the get-go that anything they were talking about wasn't really about how you lived your life. It was really about how you thought about how you lived your life, or how you thought about how other people might think about how one lives one's life. And I think part of what makes Cole such an attractive character is that he is walking the talk, which in some sense is to saying that he's practicing his religion and not just believing his religion. And that's kind of frightening in a way. And when you think about, then you start look at how nihilistic popular culture is: self-referentiality, irony to the nth degree, easy sort of nihilistic hedonism that is both kind of uncorked but not very, not even very celebratory. And, there's just this kind of bath of this, just a kind of cultural ambiance. But people within that, and this is maybe the decadence of that kind of nihilism, and Rust is by no means a decadent. There's a decadence to nihilism, which is just like not really following through, just kind of like drifting in it. And that is, in my mind, scarier, even though the consequences of really being a pessimist or a nihilist are very sobering. I mean, those are also very scary.
It's really tragic too, because it's like saying, like, it's like having enough awareness to be like, okay, I understand that there's like this idea you could be an overman or a last man, right? Like the whole Nietzschean thing. And like the pessimist that doesn't do anything is almost like saying, like, guess I'm a last man.
Yeah, might as well pop another one.
Yeah, I mean, it's
pretty good shows on Netflix.
Yeah, and it seems and there's something like really in the French existential way, you can be unmanly. There's something really unmanly about it. Like, in the myth of Sisyphus, like the very end of it is like, okay, you have Sisyphus pushing this rock up a hill, and it's going to keep crashing down on him, and it's always terrible, which is basically pessimism. But you're supposed to imagine Sisyphus smiling when he's pushing the rock up the hill. Yeah. And for some reason, that makes a lot of sense to me. Like, it's kind of how I approach other stuff. Like, if you fucking hate doing something, just do it hard and go through it. And it's kind of like, bringing Jocko Willink up again. There's a new school of what I would almost call like post-nihilist self-help, which is sort of embracing the suck, which is like the military term. That's like the new thing.
Yeah, I for me, the way I've been thinking about that lately, and it's not like a lot of other people are talking about it too, but I've kind of wrestling with my own version of it, which is thinking about it through the lens of Stoicism, and as a way of being tough and thoroughgoing through your principles in a situation in which you do not pretend or do not hold on to any idea that it doesn't suck. And what that affirmation is in that model makes a little more sense to me than the pure kind of Nietzschean call to like affirm the eternal return, to just say yes to the infinite repetition of all of my worst days unto infinity. And I'm like, that seems a little crazy. I can't really wrap my head around it. I don't know what that means exactly. And we haven't talked about the eternal return in this show, which is kind of interesting, how it floats through how the idea floats through the show. But the Stoic approach, where you're like, okay, this is suckage. Whether or not it eternally returns is another question. But the element of manning up that is within that is really been intriguing me, because I think that a lot of problems with, well, at least what I see as ways that males in general behave, particularly in light of the immense critique of white masculinity in our contemporary moment, who are attempting to not become reactionary jerks. They lose something along the way that I'm very aware of personally. I find I'm not like these. That's not me. And yet I'm not a reactionary jerk along those lines, although maybe somebody would think that given what I'm about to say. And I noticed something really interesting, which is like, there's a lot of talk about toxic masculinity, right? And, there's a cluster of different effects that people associate with toxic masculinity depending on who you're talking to. Obviously, some things are very obviously, violent misogyny. Of course, what are you talking about? That's toxic humanity. But one of the things you'll find people regularly critique is stoicism. They'll say, well, the traditional male role is that you're a stoic. You don't feel your feelings. Well, actually, that's not what it's about. It's actually about being fully aware of what your feelings are, as in,
and you do
this
it anyway.
Sucks.
Yeah.
But you do it, and you don't fucking tell everybody about it. You don't fucking cry about it. You don't expect everybody else to help you process what that fucking thing is. And I don't think that's reactionary at all. And a lot of people do. All right, already what I've said, there'll be people who are, if they're into this stuff, would be like, I don't know, man, that sounds a lot like that old patriarchal thing. And I'm like, well, okay, maybe. But I think once you acknowledge that the feelings are not being repressed so much as you're making a choice not to spill them out, is actually kind of a good thing. And then it dovetailed in this really weird, because I was like, okay, man, there's more to this. And it dovetailed with this really great essay. You might have seen it. It's like Against Ally Politics. And it's like, it was on an anarchist site. And I think it's written by, it's not altogether clear. Maybe if I read more about it, I'd know who produced it more, but I just read the piece itself. Seems like it's produced by activists of color in a very clear-eyed, level-headed way, addressing particularly white guys, but other, characters who might be allies. And it's the basic conclusion is like, just shut up. Just keep it to yourself. Like, this is not about you processing your guilt. Like, go ahead, feel guilty. It sucks. There's a lot of suck around. Just, hold it in. Work with us. We'll step forward together. And it was basically I was like, oh yeah, it's just like, actually, some more stoicism would really help a lot of, especially white guys who get caught up with being like, oh, this, and we got to do this, and we got to do it. Here's my thing, and I'm the hero, and I'm doing this thing within the context of that kind of activism. And so I've been coming around a lot to like thinking through whether you call it stoicism, whether you call it a certain way of manning up or saying yes to the suck or whatever the situation is, as being a very precious element that is, associated with masculinity, by no means restricted to males, that our contemporary discourse around masculinity or whatever is very, or at least on the progressive side, is very much in danger of losing. And by losing it, you make it much more likely that anybody who feels that way ends up feeling more comfortable in the Jordan Peterson, into, other farther, darker zones, because he's a complicated figure. But
yeah, we've stuck our toe into the Peterson verse a few times.
Yeah, it's like
my whole thing with him is he's just a self-help author, like, ultimately. And and I think the only problem with him right now, like, one, he kind of came into fame off of like trans pronoun issue, which people don't even fucking understand, like, period. Like, no matter how deep you are into the stuff, like, it's going to be very difficult to even have like a really coherent space for, pronoun identity, because it's designed to be not a space. Like, I think one of the things that's so interesting and appealing about having all these multiplicity of genders is that it's non-binary. And I think once you get out of binary thought, things become sort of more interesting or whatever. But Stoicism, what it has, I think, going for it, and the reason why it's so popular amongst like Silicon Valley types now is helps you move the ball down the road a little bit in your life. You know, it gives you like something to do, a way to be. And I think that, you know, you're never going to get that out of like real deal pessimism or actual nihilism. Like, because ultimately, what are you going to do? Like, what do you do?
You can't apply Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet towards health goals.
No, like, I mean, like the closest you could get is, you know, like maybe you start to think about, and this, you know, you start to think about like, okay, well, if there is no thing, no truth or whatever, then what the fuck do I care about being woke, period, for? Since there is no morality, there is no real, like, whose morality, right? Like, so I think that one of the reasons why you'll probably never see like a mainstream adoption of like pessimistic philosophy is it's really a pretty shortcut to the most appealing part of it, which is to go full Lord Humongous, you know, and from Mad Max, just be like, well, I'm a fucking conquering god until I'm taken out. And I think there's a lot of appeal in that, personally. You know, it's like, what would you rather be? Would you rather be, you know, you wanted, like, you know, just to name it, like the Ten Commandments movie. Would you rather be building the pyramid or holding the whip? Like, most people would rather not be building the pyramid, you know, and there's just not enough whips to go around, I guess, is why people get upset.
I think a lot of people, once they realize early in life that whip is never going to be in their hands, they'd rather build community around.
Well, that's the slave morality. That's Nietzsche's slave morality. And that's the last man, right? Like, that's the argument right there is like, okay, most of us aren't going to be in control. So let's build a system that privileges people who aren't in control. And that's Christianity. You know, and so now we have all this, you know, even culture is attacking all that stuff. Like, oh, it's bad, it's bad, it's bad. It's the whole thing about like, you shouldn't take down fences when you don't know what's on the other side of the fence. So you have this whole move to like, okay, let's take apart all these like power structures. But what if all that's left is a bunch of nihilist shitheads who just want to fuck each other over? Which seems like it probably is, right? Like, maybe.
Certainly,
you know,
worth put money on it.
Yeah. And then the people who are like, oh, that's not good, that's terrible, or whatever. I was thinking about this girl I was talking to at work the other day. Very nice, very super woke person. But she was talking about The Walking Dead. She's talking about the character Negan. She's like, oh, he's like this totally hot psychopath. I was like, right there. Like, you referred to him as a hot psychopath. Like, so there's like an appeal to this, like, amoral, like, you do whatever the fuck you want, like, bad character. But I mean, but then in True Detective, you have the same kind of character, but he's not even a nice guy. Like, that's what's kind of interesting about Russ Cole is he's both this terrible guy, you know, he even says like, you know, I do bad things with impunity, but he's also like the hero in a traditional, like, he saves the girl. Yeah,
he's something about demons, and he says, you know, we keep the worst demons from the door or whatever.
Yeah, well, they were talking about bad men, right?
Bad men.
He's like we keep bad men from the door.
You know, the other bad men.
And I mean, you see that in like modern militia rhetoric. You know, they talk about like being sheepdogs. You know, there's like wolves and sheepdogs, and the difference between the wolf and the sheepdog is the sheepdog happens to like the sheep. Like it's interesting. Like I mean, that's like a really live.
That's a live
thing right now. Yeah. Like, and it's like, okay, well, what's informing that? It's not Christianity. You know, like, because the language of that is like shepherds. You know, and sheep. So, you know, it's like, it's different. It's like this acknowledgement of this darkness. And it's what lets Russ Cole and even Marty become good, is that they know how to be fucking bad. You know, and so I'm saying that it's better to be bad than good. Probably.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe.
Interesting.
All right.
I still think that there's more of an interesting connection between Stoicism and pessimism. One is, or there's different ways of framing it. One is that if to the degree that I am not hiding from a pessimist interpretation of things, my own existential situation, but I am still aware that I can make choices. Mm-hmm. This doesn't mean you can't make choices. There is a version of where you say, no, we're programmed puppets, which is partly what Cole seems to say, and what you sometimes find people say, okay, we're totally programmed. And it's like, well, no, even if there's no self, the arising of the perception of a self is some kind of embodied process that doesn't have a substance, but it is a process. It's part of natural history. It's happening right now, and you're in it. And within that, without getting into the free will question, there seems to be certain places where you can maneuver and other places where you can't. And to become very clear-eyed about what you can do as opposed to what you can't do could still create a sense of responsibility and existential affirmation, if you will, within a pessimist context. Like, I think you can still be affirmative within a basically pessimistic frame. And one of the places you see that is the way people wrestle with that with Buddhism, which is really interesting. Now, of course, there's many Buddhisms. It's complicated. There's in any given national, particular expression of Buddhism, there's tons of different variations. So it's hard to generalize, but I think you can say that one of the interesting, unusual things about Buddhism in the contemporary world is that it allows people to have a place for a kind of existential meaninglessness that isn't repressed, is not tarted up, is not reframed or repackaged, and yet doesn't kind of steal the show. And so there's this sort of tension in there because it's in the text. I mean, some of the texts are like, you're a puppet, you're just a meat machine, there's nothing here, blah, blah, you're going to die, everything's going to change, blah, blah, blah. You're like, whoa, it's a religion? Jesus, there's nothing, help. And then there are other forms that are much more like religion with a capital R, where there's some salvation, there's heavens you get to go to and punishment for the bad actions and da-da-da. But in the modern world, I think one of the reasons that Buddhism has been more popular is because it sort of allows for a kind of secular, non-supernatural, even existential, meaningless acknowledgement of that dimension of reality without, let's say, entirely submitting to it. And so I guess I'm kind of reflecting on my own inconsistencies is that who says we have to be thoroughgoing in any of it? If we're going to be pessimistic, is it like if we fall short of any of like, I'm so pessimistic I can't get out of bed, or I'm not going to get out of bed, or I'm going to kill myself. If I do my job and, it turns out I'm good at being a detective, so I'm going to be a detective and do this kind of thing, am I breaking my code? Am I being a hypocrite? Is he just as hypocritical as Marty is about the family and lust? Or not, and that I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure about that. I mean, I think part of what I think about with Stoicism and pessimism as well is that on my bad days, I'm there. I'm 100% there, and I'm not holding back, and I'm super articulate, and it's like everything's a show. There are empty puppets on the street. It's like it's a grim scene. I also know that I don't always live there. And in this world, there are people that I love. And I may not be able to totally tune into that in that moment, but I kind of know that that's there. So there's also kind of like, how do I be true to this experience, but not make the kind of religious error of going, now I know the truth. Now I hold the actual truth, and I will carry it with me forward as I move through the constant changes of life. So I'm kind of interested in how a kind of stoical attitude in the midst of the suffering of those perceptions can both acknowledge them, but not completely submit to what sometimes seems to be the only way out is suicide or some kind of complete dismantling of any, not moral, but just any kind of principle or value that you might work towards because it's pointless. That doesn't seem to be quite necessary, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether that's simply an inconsistency.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Bringing that back to True Detective is that Rust Cohle's come around was through revelation. It wasn't a sort of vacillation. Of course, we don't know where, as we said before, we don't know where he started from, how he got there. But it was through revelation that he came out the other side.
Yeah, through a vision. His other visions. Yeah.
Yeah, it really, like in Conspiracy Against the Human Race, he talks about Krishnamurti a little bit, which is not the Krishnamurti that everybody likes. There's the other one, like J. Krishnamurti, I think is the one that like yoga girls like. And then Krishnamurti was in the same sort of circles because his name's Krishnamurti and he was operating at the same time. But he had an experience which was like not quite enlightenment, but like a dissolution of self. And so Russ Cole talks about, when he's going into darkness, his definitions disappear. And when Krishnamurti, he had like an accident or something like that. Right. And when he came back, he was like, well, I've experienced what it's like to not actually have a self. And pretty much everybody else who tells you how to get to the state is just full of shit. It's just a thing that happens. So to him, like his spiritual experience really seemed to be a way of upholding it is all just chance and randomness and bullshit too. But hey, you can make a go of it, sort of. And I keep thinking about like Russ Cole's transition at the very end. Like he has like like a pretty much off the shelf near death experience. There's like light at the end of the tunnel and the whole deal. And he comes back and it's like he did try to let go, like because he talks about all the the happiness in the victim's eyes that he sees people who just decided to let go. And there's this like this Schopenhauer will thing. Like did it bring him back from the dead? He doesn't seem to care about that at all. Like he's just in a weird uncharacteristic way just bolted on this happy ending to his pessimistic philosophy. And I think it's like even that dude at the end of the day can't abide by that philosophy. Like I just think you're going to kill yourself if you really believe in this shit. Like there would be no logical. I mean, I was about to eat a bullet before I came here because I was like, why am I even doing this podcast? Pessimism is real.
It's a bummer.
Yeah.
It's true. No, and it's
well, it was love that brought him through. I mean, that was like let's be specific. It wasn't just like a happy ending. Right. It was love that he sought that brought him through that moment. Which again, in this dichotomy between the two main characters, is the thing that Marty always had and continually threw away. And just as a side note, actually, kind of my favorite thing about this show is that the best example of how bad a parent Marty is that his daughter became a goth.
You fucked up if your kid ended up being a goth. Like, you definitely...
Which means both our parents were terrible parents.
Here's the thing about being a goth, is it's like, you didn't fuck up the kid enough for them to be interesting, really. You just fucked them up enough to pull, like, an off-the-shelf interesting look, like, for themselves. Like, that's...
Although to her credit as a goth, it is great that her first goth dinner that we see is her hurling the same shit across the dinner table that Rust would. Mm-hmm. But Daddy thinks it's charming.
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah. Like, I mean, you really want to, you don't want to end up with Marty's daughter. You want to end up with Russ Cole if you're going to raise a kid fucked up. I mean...
And that's why you don't have kids.
That's exactly why I don't have kids.
Actually, it is. I will say it is interesting that. Wait, Eric, do you have kids?
No.
Yeah, I didn't think so. Okay, yeah, I mean, have we used the words antinatalism yet?
No, we haven't gone down that.
Okay,
that one.
I mean, I don't know that we need to totally go down that, but that is definitely another sort of like philosophical avenue we could go down that is in this and in Rust Cole and in the fact that, again, Marty is this parent who's a shitty parent and sort of abandons his family despite it being ostensibly the most important thing and the only trigger he really has. But we're discussing this and we're three men who've chosen to not have kids. Well, it's a choice for Chad and I can't speak for all three, but
no, that's an interesting one because it that shifts the dialogue as well away from the like, well, if there's no consequence, if there's no meaning, then why don't I kill myself? It's like you can imagine getting to a place where you acknowledge the value of love or of being good to the people around you, and trying to keep it together as much as you can and support the people around you, as a way through a kind of pessimistic view without denying the ultimate claims of pessimism. But it's a very different thing to be that person and then say, okay, I'm going to bring someone into this thresher. That's a great, one of the great lines in the book. And that's a real question. And it's a funny one too, because I think it's one of the places where when you don't have kids and you think about stuff like this, that you see those strategies, those 4 strategies of anchoring and distraction and whatever. Like it's, you're like, oh, you had a kid, or like, oh, you're going to, oh, really?
That's as anchoring as it gets.
What's that about? And you kind of like, you're really curious. Like, how do you like, or especially with people you've had these conversations with before, where you've like, what they think about the future. Like, in the best case scenario, they're going to be like cyborg to the nines. That's if they're not whatever. I mean, it's just crazy. I mean, just on that stuff, let alone like the higher principle about whether you should bring anybody into this conundrum. The specific existential circumstances that we're in right now, kind of heighten the whole conversation. And yet there you are, you're hearing their reasons, you're hearing the story, and you're kind of like, okay, like it makes sense, kind of. It's sort of not what I'm doing, but like I might have an opinion about it, but it's not like there's been any shift where like people are like you can imagine a scenario where like it's all kind of like it is now, and people are like, oh, we're gonna have a kid. I'm sorry. It's like, I'm sorry. I know some people do. Like it was like sort of a guilty, like you feel bad about it. You feel like indulgent, like you're like you can't help yourself but do that. Seems pretty reasonable to me, and yet it's so far not. I mean, it's like not even floating in the air. That kind of sense that there's something kind of indulgent about it. Or
the closest you get, and it's so realistically portrayed in Idiocracy, it's like dumb people are just out fucking people who should probably have kids and raise kids. Like that's just seems to be the way of it. But then again, like I mean, if you raise some kid with like knowledge of philosophy, is that kid going to be any better off or happier? Probably not. No. When I don't find like Russ Cole is explicitly antinatalist, and he has all the rhetoric, he's rolling it all out. But antinatalism to me seems like an absolutely unnecessary offshoot of all this pessimistic philosophy, because it's like, okay, if you really do believe it's all bad, it's fucking terrible, it's going to work itself out. I mean, it's only getting worse. You're eventually not going to have the choice of whether or not you want to be an antinatalist or not. It's just going to all bad.
Like, why fetishize that choice as some kind of particular?
Yeah, it's like Marty tells Rust, he's like, yeah, for a guy who doesn't care, you seem to be worrying about this an awful lot. Right. Which I think is like really one of the best criticisms of the character of Russ Cole. It's like, why would you even bother being like this? Like I feel like if you really did have that sort of mindset, your best move would be to become like some sort of like Peter Thiel like criminal, where you just like you're like, okay, well, I agree there is no morality or goodness or anything in life, so I'm just gonna go full pirate, like take what I can, give nothing back. It's like, why wouldn't you do that? And I think it's reasonable way to live, probably.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that comes around to like whether you have people who have their value structure, their personality structure is religious. It's just that they have this pessimistic perspective. So they still need a value, or they need something to work for, to be clear about, or to be, to draw boundaries around. And you see Cole do that all the time. Whereas I think a lot of what you're talking about is like, if you really saw that worldview, you would abandon that kind of moral structure in light of it. And so then it would be like, who cares? You do what you want to do. It doesn't really matter. It's all going to go down the tubes anyway. And so that's part of, again, what makes it an interesting character, is because he does have a crucifix on the wall in this very interesting way. I mean, there's something in the Christ that he can see. And it's like that moment of, I'm going to take this on, or I'm completely alone. I mean, he talks about the moment in the garden, which is interesting, but like Zizek talks about the moment it's actually on the cross, when God can't see him because he's got to like withdraw, like, oh, why have you abandoned me? Like, I made it all this way. I fucking drank the poison. I've got the fucking, vinegar on my wounds, and I'm dying here. And then now you abandon me. And that like moment of being this kind of moment where religion no longer functions, because now you are out. Now even the God man is operating outside of God, and so there's a lot of things you can play with that. And Cole's like close to that turn, but doesn't quite take it all on.
I guess that would be a good random time. Got an email from our friend Jeremy Lassen, who was on our episode about It. Wrote, "Is it just me, or is it weird/awesome that the final scene where Rust abandons his pessimism and reveals his, quote, 'I was with my daughter, I don't belong here' moment is channeling the Buffy the Vampire Slayer musical when she sings the 'I Think I Was in Heaven' song?" I think that's amazing. And I also just got a Buffy tattoo, so it was very well timed for me to cross these two things over. Chad's not are you a Buffy fan, Eric? Really?
Like,
have you tried?
I half-heartedly.
Yeah.
I don't tend to care. I don't care for a certain kind of winky humor in my horror fantasy. Like I have a kind of, I mean, I like some comedy very much, but like that, I kind of want to go and get I like the serious in those modes. So,
are there horror comedies? Do those intersect in some instances that you can think of that you love? Like Scream or Cabin in the Woods or What We Do in the Shadows.
I think
or
Evil Dead 2 is
or,
pretty funny.
Which one?
Evil Dead 2 is pretty funny.
Totally.
You know, so but that's like a kind of clown, like it's like the whole thing is like this sort of clownish excess. I think it's the more the in-jokey kind of ironic play. I hate like Douglas Adams.
Right.
Get that shit away from me.
Yeah.
It's jokey, whatever, that kind of coy. Neil Gaiman goes that way far too often, even though he if he didn't, he'd be better.
I agree. Yeah, I agree.
British feminists.
What about them?
All these people, they're British feminists.
They're what?
I was going to make I didn't pull it together. I was going to make a joke. What I meant to do was bring back another joke about Josh Whedon's like faux feminism, which we've joked about in the past.
Yes. Okay.
And it totally didn't work. You can probably edit that one out too. That joke was not working.
No, again, I'm putting that right up front.
Yeah. I feel like I had something to say about that though, then I squandered it.
Buffy?
Fuck yeah.
Comedy?
Buffy.
You were going to disparage Buffy?
No, I was going to disparage.
I don't care if you can't remember.
I wasn't going to disparage Buffy. But what I was going to say is Buffy fans have like it's like their book. There's like the hermeneutics of Buffy are super strong. Like people, once they've seen it, no longer see it anything else. They just see Buffy.
I feel like Rick and Morty is similar.
Mm-hmm.
Like Rick and Morty fans are just have... Those glasses have a strong tint once you put them on.
But Joss Whedon, though, man, like I feel like his tone is the tone of all the Marvel films. Like, I mean, especially Guardian of the Galaxy. Like, I think he, like Firefly won the culture war.
Right. I feel like that's an example, one of those examples of someone who was really good at something and did something really well, and then you unfortunately have to blame them for the shit that they influenced.
Yeah. But, it's interesting, though. Like, he had a lot of hits. And that's kind of, so far, like, True Detective, Nick Pizzolatto is 1 and 2 in TV land. You know? Like, so I'm curious if, like, an author like that.
Well, he was The Killing season 1, which was a great season.
Oh, he wrote that too, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Season 2 ate shit, but...
There you go.
Haha.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean... But I guess what's fun about Joss Whedon is the jokes. Like that's kind of the whole deal. Like I don't think you get Cabin in the Woods without Joss Whedon, and I really liked Cabin in the Woods.
I like Cabin in the Woods a lot.
Yeah.
But Cabin in the Woods, what's so funny about that is it's like a workplace movie, ultimately, and I think that it's basically Office Space but with cosmic horror.
Yeah.
Which is a good idea, I guess.
Your favorite thing and your least favorite thing.
Yeah. Do you think of yourself as more of a Marty or more of a Rust Cole?
I do have to say, when I watched this the second time, just watching Rust with a little more distance, kind of realized I agreed with like almost everything he said. A couple of times I broke ranks, but pretty much everything out of his mouth, I'm not a pessimist, actually, but I do lean pretty hard that way. I think I really don't live it. I'm a pretty happy guy.
Well, that's where you get into temperament, and that's one of those, like, it's actually kind of the question we started out with, is this, either is his position the result of this event that happened to him, or possibly even his temperament? Someone has a melancholic temperament. You ask them about life, they tend to wax pessimistic and depressive, and you're like, how much of this is your temperament? And so then you find but the reverse of that is that you can be a temperamentally happy person, or engaged with a humor, like people, but still see that same stuff, because it's also a philosophical position. It's also a way of understanding the world, and that seems to me a sweet spot to be, and is to kind of cultivate that lightness or that capacity, or to allow it to shine forth, but not he talks about towards the end, like, I'm not going to avert my eyes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of like not averting the eyes. There's a lot of that throughout the whole show. Like, don't look at the video. Oh, the video. Nope. You got to look at it. There's a lot of don't avert your eyes. And there's a value to that, but you don't have to do that all the time.
Yeah. It's interesting talking about this in podcast land because I sort of love listening to self-help podcasts and audiobooks, even if I don't care what they're saying or don't buy the bullshit. I just find there's something useful about having positive voices rambling around in my head while I'm doing other things. So rather than it be my favorite murder and just it be comedy or something like that, just to have people being encouraging, even though I know they're full of shit. It's just nice. It's like turning the lights up really bright or opening the windows first thing in the morning.
Right.
But getting ready for this podcast, I rather than reread Conspiracy Against the Human Race, I listened to it on audiobook and had the opposite, where for those, whatever it was, 9 hours or however long the audiobook of that Ligotti piece is, of having this like horrible voice inside my head, just nonstop, just saying the worst shit. Like as soon as I woke up and then when I was going to sleep, it was kind of tough.
Yeah, in Conspiracy Against the Human Race, he has that whole section that's kind of about self-help books. And, he kind of like, as you would expect, would shit on him. And then he uses the refrain, I'm getting better every day in each and every way, or whatever the line is. He uses it throughout the book, but like kind of twisted a little bit to reaffirm like all of his pessimism and stuff like that. And I found myself like not getting into like a bleak mood, but definitely not at my best while I was reading all of this stuff. And we had joked about having a podcast called Self-Help for Nihilists, where we sort of like go over like traditional self-help books about what they are and what the appeal is. And I think that's like the Nietzschean thing where it's like, okay, it's all not true. It's all fake. It's all, it's just slave morality versus whatever. Then you're supposed to just imagine yourself as like this heroic character. And that seems to be really become a bit of the zeitgeist these days. Like that's Joe Rogan's advice, is to wake up in the morning and imagine you're the hero of a character. And you've just, you're like he even uses the language of like detective shows. He's like, you wake up and you're hungover and you got to solve the crime that day and you got to go figure it out. And it's like, I don't feel like pessimism or any of that sort of philosophy like helps you do that. Like, I mean, you might have a better understanding of what you're up against, but I don't know. It doesn't. I mean, I think that's why people back into stoicism. It's just easy to understand and be easy to deal with. But I mean, there's also like the Viktor Frankl thing, where it's like you just sort of have to imagine your life as you want it to be, or at least you don't have to be a miserable bastard all the time. You can choose that, and then that backs right up to ceremonial magic, like the idea that you're making your own future, you're making your own world. Like have you ever heard the Grant Morrison Disinfo talk, like where he talks about Robert Anton Wilson and all the things you're shown are true? So you wonder, like in the context of True Detective, like are these characters, had they made themselves more miserable by paying attention to these like more miserable ideas?
Yeah, and that comes around to the infection of it. That's the horror of philosophy, is like, oh wait, if I imbibe too much of it, I might actually, then I can't get back to being the hero, or even just getting back to like the normal life. Like, how far can I go reading this, the Necronomicon by Schopenhauer? It has the same sort of, which is an interesting way of thinking about philosophy. Are there thoughts I shouldn't spend too much time around because they're not good for me? But then you get that health element in there, and that can be critiqued in all sorts of ways. But it's also very, it's very pragmatic. It's very empirical. It's very much right here in front of us. It's also very, very Nietzschean. Even, he was a sick guy a lot. He was very aware of his body. He was very aware of the idea of health and healthiness. And while that can become a certain kind of fascist logic, it's also a pragmatic one. And you're like, yeah, some of this stuff is good. It clears the fog from your eyes, but too much of it, like too much of anything, is unbalanced and makes you sick.
Shall we?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Let's fade to black and roll the credits. Eric, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure, really of course. It was a great time.
Really awesome. So if you don't already, if you're an Erik Davis fan, for example, and have come this way via that, Subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or however you got here. Join our mailing list at scarythoughts.org, and we will see you next time for Black Christmas. Ho, ho, ho. Thanks for listening.
I've been eating garbage for like 2 months now.